The early light of that particular April morning in 1943 broke over the tropical waters surrounding the Solomon Islands, illuminating a scene that would soon become one of the most significant moments in naval aviation history. Within less than 20 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy would experience a personal catastrophe unlike any other during the entire Pacific campaign. 6 exceptionally skilled Zero fighter pilots, carefully selected for what they believed would be the pinnacle of their military service, were about to endure what military analysts would later describe as the most complete protective failure in the annals of Japanese naval air warfare. What unfolded that day transcends the simple narrative of a successful ambush operation. Instead, it represents a complex examination of how half a dozen of Japan's finest aviators, operating what many considered the Pacific theater's most formidable fighter aircraft, proved unable to safeguard the single individual whose continued existence held greater strategic value than any naval vessel, territorial possession, or tactical engagement. Military scholars have grappled with a deceptively straightforward yet profoundly intricate question ever since that fateful morning. What factors conspired to ensure that 6 veteran Zero pilots, deliberately chosen for their exceptional abilities and arranged in a protective formation specifically designed for escort duties, could not prevent 2 American bomber aircraft from completing their deadly mission in clear daylight conditions? The answer encompasses far more than simple tactical error. Rather, it reveals a convergence of technological constraints, strategic misjudgments, and fundamental misconceptions that would ultimately claim the life of Japan's most intellectually brilliant naval strategist. Our analysis will examine every facet of this operational disaster, ranging from the detailed technical characteristics of the aircraft involved to the instantaneous decisions that determined Admiral Yamamoto's destiny. Historical accounts typically frame Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's demise as a testament to American intelligence gathering and operational planning, yet remarkably few analyses scrutinize the Japanese side of this equation with appropriate rigor. The 6 Zero pilots assigned to fly that day have largely been consigned to historical obscurity, nameless escorts who merely fell short of their objective. Nothing could be further from the truth. These were hardly ordinary aviators. Every one of them belonged to the 204th Naval Air Group, an elite unit whose members had endured the brutal aerial combat over Guadalcanal, individuals who had engaged American fighters on countless occasions and survived to continue fighting. Their inability to fulfill their mission stemmed not from lack of competence or personal courage, but rather from systemic deficiencies that permeated Imperial Japanese Navy fighter doctrine, problems that would only manifest themselves fully during the crucible of combat that morning in April. The fundamental question we must address extends beyond merely documenting what transpired, demanding instead that we understand why such an event was permitted to occur in the first place. What circumstances rendered Japan's premier fighter aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M-3 Model 3, when piloted by some of the Navy's most seasoned aviators, incapable of accomplishing what should have been a straightforward protective assignment? The explanation involves an intricate network of technical deficiencies, doctrinal shortcomings, and a basic failure to comprehend how aerial combat had evolved by the spring of 1943. This mission took place merely 2 days following the completion of Operation Igo, Yamamoto's final major offensive undertaking, with the Admiral travelling to personally commend the units that had participated in those operations. At Rabaul's Lakunai airfield, during the morning hours of April 17th, an unusual atmosphere of tension pervaded the ready room where pilots of the 204th Naval Air Group gathered. 6 aviators received summons for a special briefing, one that immediately distinguished this assignment from the countless patrol missions and scramble alerts that had characterized their recent combat experience. The men selected represented the cream of experienced naval aviation. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki brought more than 2 years of combat operations to his role as section leader. Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita had already achieved ace status with approximately 30 confirmed victories to his credit. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka possessed 20 confirmed kills and demonstrated tactical expertise that had kept him alive through some of the most savage air battles witnessed over Guadalcanal. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya had been credited with 8 aerial victories and earned recognition for his exceptional marksmanship skills. Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinue brought steady nerves and veteran experience to the formation, while Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki, though younger than his comrades, had already proven himself under fire. Commander Tadashi Nakajima of the 204th Air Group personally conducted the briefing. The following day, these 6 pilots would receive the supreme privilege of escorting Admiral Yamamoto himself during an inspection tour to Bougainville. The profound significance of this assignment could hardly be exaggerated. Yamamoto represented far more than simply another fleet commander. He embodied the intellectual foundation of Japan's entire naval strategy, the brilliant architect behind the Pearl Harbor operation, and perhaps the sole Japanese leader who genuinely grasped both Japan's military capabilities and its fundamental limitations in conducting war against America's overwhelming industrial might. The pilots recognized immediately that this transcended routine military duty, representing instead a sacred responsibility. The Admiral intended to visit installations at Balale and Buin to personally congratulate the pilots who had just completed Operation Go. What these Japanese pilots preparing their aircraft at Rabaul could not possibly know was that 1,600 miles distant at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had just accomplished one of the war's most remarkable intelligence breakthroughs. On April 14th, multiple American radio intercept stations detected a Japanese naval transmission designated NTF-131755, encrypted using the JN-25D cipher that American codebreakers had been steadily decrypting since before the Midway Battle. This particular message, addressed to commanders of Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla, contained something unprecedented in its specificity. The decrypt revealed a comprehensive itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's forthcoming inspection tour, complete with precise departure times, arrival times, and exact routing information. At Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the decrypted message displayed Yamamoto's schedule with extraordinary precision. Departure from Rabaul would occur at 600 hours. Arrival at Balale Island airstrip was scheduled for 800 hours. Surface transport to Shortland Island by submarine chaser would commence at 8:40. Arrival at Shortland was planned for 9:40 hours. Following lunch with senior officers, departure from Shortland would take place at 1400 hours, with return to Rabaul expected by 1540 hours. The American intelligence officers could scarcely credit their extraordinary fortune. The Japanese, with their characteristic obsession for meticulous planning and punctuality, had inadvertently provided a perfect blueprint for targeted assassination. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had to authorize what would follow, and after consultation with Washington, the decision was rendered. Yamamoto had to be eliminated. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the planning for what became known as Operation Vengeance commenced with a sobering mathematical reality. The distance from Guadalcanal to the planned interception point near Bougainville measured 420 miles, at the absolute extreme limit of the P-38 Lightning's operational range, achievable only with supplementary fuel tanks and flawless navigation. Major John Mitchell, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, worked through the night of April 17th alongside his operations staff, calculating fuel consumption rates, wind velocities, and the precise timing required to intercept Yamamoto's flight at the single point where it would be within range and flying at low altitude. The operational plan that emerged demanded audacious precision. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters were assigned to the mission, though ultimately only 16 would participate after 2 aircraft developed mechanical difficulties during engine start procedures. These 16 P-38s would follow a meticulously calculated route that maintained them beyond the detection range of Japanese radar installations and coast watcher positions, preserving complete radio silence while flying at wave-top altitude to prevent visual detection. The flight path consisted of 5 distinct legs, each timed with exacting precision. Any deviation from course, any mechanical malfunction, any navigational miscalculation would result in complete mission failure. The interception was calculated for 9:35 in the morning, providing the American fighters exactly 15 minutes of combat time before fuel considerations would force them to turn homeward toward Guadalcanal. The 6-0 pilots conducting pre-flight preparations on their A6M-3 Model 22 fighters at Rabaul represented the evolutionary development of Japan's most celebrated fighter aircraft. However, by April 1943, evolution had paradoxically become a strategic liability. The Zero that had astonished the world in 1940 represented a revolutionary synthesis of operational range, aerial maneuverability, and offensive firepower, achieved through radical weight reduction measures. Every component had been scrutinized for excess weight. The resulting aircraft featured no armor protection whatsoever for the pilot, completely lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, and possessed an airframe constructed to the absolute minimum structural strength requirements permissible. The outcome was a fighter aircraft that could outmaneuver virtually anything encountered in aerial combat, with an operational range that seemed physically impossible for a carrier-based fighter. By 1943, however, the Zero's fundamental design philosophy had transformed into its greatest vulnerability. The A6M-3 variant these pilots would fly had attempted to address certain weaknesses. A more powerful Sakai 21 engine generated 1130 horsepower, providing improved high-altitude performance characteristics and marginally better diving speeds. Nevertheless, the fundamental vulnerabilities remained unaddressed. The Zero still provided no pilot armor protection, still carried aviation fuel in unprotected tanks that transformed the aircraft into an airborne incendiary device when struck by enemy fire, and most critically for the upcoming mission, still lacked sufficient speed to either pursue or escape from the new generation of American fighters entering service. The A6M-3 Model 22 could achieve a maximum velocity of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet altitude. The P-38 Lightning that would attack them the following morning could reach 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, could outdive it without risk of structural failure, and carried sufficient concentrated firepower to destroy a Zero with a single accurate burst. The defensive formation these Japanese pilots would employ the next day reflected tactical doctrine developed in China against vastly inferior opposition, not the operational reality of 1943. Standard defensive positioning placed fighter escorts above and behind the bombers under their protection, an arrangement ideal for diving attacks against hostile aircraft approaching from higher altitudes, representing the classic fighter attack profile familiar from earlier combat. This formation arrangement contained a fatal vulnerability. It could not adequately defend against attackers approaching from below and behind, precisely the attack vector the Americans had planned. The Zero pilots would position themselves at approximately 6,500 feet altitude, roughly 1,500 feet above the 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers from the 705th Air Group. Bomber No. 323 carried Admiral Yamamoto, while Bomber No. 326 transported Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki along with additional staff officers. The escorts would scan the sky for threats they anticipated would materialize from above, while death approached from below. As the Japanese formation neared Bougainville at 9:30 hours, the 6-0 pilots maintained their vigilant observation of the sky above and ahead of their position. This represented the direction from which threats invariably materialized, diving from the sun's direction, exploiting altitude advantage to build velocity for a single slashing attack pass. Lieutenant Morisaki, leading the escort formation, positioned his 2 sections with textbook precision according to established doctrine, maintaining spacing that permitted mutual support while providing coverage of the maximum possible area of sky. They were now over the jungle terrain of Bougainville itself, the airfield at Balal visible in the distance ahead, perhaps 5 minutes from landing. The most hazardous portion of the journey appeared nearly complete. The threat, however, did not originate from the direction they anticipated. At 9:34 hours, Mitchell's top cover flight spotted the Japanese formation precisely where intelligence had predicted: 2 bomber aircraft and 6 fighters in perfect formation, completely oblivious to the 16 P-38s approaching from the south at treetop altitude. Mitchell keyed his radio for the first transmission in more than 2 hours. Bogies at 11 o'clock high. Captain Thomas Lanphier, leading the killer flight, could hardly believe their remarkable fortune. The Japanese were exactly on schedule, positioned exactly where expected, and evidently completely unaware of the danger approaching from below. The P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks and commenced their attack run. What transpired next occurred with such extraordinary rapidity that participants would debate the exact sequence of events for decades afterward. The Zero escorts, continuously scanning the sky above and the ocean horizon ahead, failed to detect the olive-drab P-38s climbing from below until the American fighters had already closed to within gun range. The American fighters, painted in dark olive and grey camouflage schemes, blended almost perfectly with the jungle canopy backdrop, a colour scheme developed specifically for Southwest Pacific operations that proved devastatingly effective. By the time Petty Officer Yanagiya, flying the outermost position on the right side of the formation, spotted the approaching P-38s and transmitted a warning, Lieutenant Rex Barber had already positioned himself within 50 yards of Yamamoto's bomber, his finger poised on the trigger mechanism. Barber's attack execution was textbook perfection. Approaching from the bomber's 7 o'clock position, below and behind where the tail gunner could not depress his weapon sufficiently to engage effectively, he opened fire with all 4 50-caliber machine guns and his single 20mm cannon simultaneously. The concentrated firepower tore into the Betty's right engine, right wing root, and fuselage structure. In his subsequent after-action report, Barber would describe observing the bomber's right engine beginning to stream black smoke and white vapor, a mixture of engine oil and aviation fuel, as his explosive shells found their mark. He continued firing as closure distance decreased, shifting his aim point to the left engine, observing pieces of the aircraft's structure breaking away under the impact of his fire. Morisaki and Hidaka, leading the left section of the escort, spotted the P-38s and immediately rolled their fighters inverted, pulling through split S maneuvers while diving toward the American aircraft with their wingmen following. However, they were initiating their intervention from 1,500 feet above and behind the ongoing action, a geometric relationship that rendered effective intervention physically impossible. The fundamental physics of acceleration and distance meant that even diving at full throttle, pushing their Zeros to the structural limits, they could not reach the American fighters before catastrophic damage had been inflicted on the bomber. Chief Petty Officer Hidaka, commanding the right side section, banked hard toward Barber's P-38. The American pilot was already pulling away from the mortally wounded bomber, exploiting the lightning's superior velocity to escape before the Zeros could bring their weapons to bear effectively. Yamamoto's bomber, grievously damaged, nosed downward toward the jungle canopy with its right engine engulfed in flames. The pilot, Warrant Officer Takeo Kotani, fought desperately to maintain aircraft control, but with one engine completely destroyed and control surfaces damaged, the aircraft was doomed. The Betty impacted the jungle canopy at 9:38 hours, merely 4 minutes after the initial sighting of American fighters. The second bomber, transporting Vice Admiral Ugaki, attempted escape toward the ocean but was intercepted by Lieutenant Besby Holmes, who inflicted severe damage. This aircraft also crashed, though Ugaki would miraculously survive, extracted from the wreckage with serious injuries. Only Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagaya managed any form of effective retaliation. As the P-38s disengaged and turned southward toward Guadalcanal, he spotted one Lightning struggling behind the others, trailing smoke from one engine. This was Lieutenant Raymond Hines' aircraft, damaged either by defensive fire from the bombers or during the combat engagement. Yanagiya pursued the wounded Lightning, closing to effective gun range and firing repeated bursts from his 20mm cannon. He observed strikes on the P-38's wing and fuselage structures, witnessed fuel streaming from punctured tanks, but the rugged American fighter continued flying, its surviving engine pulling it toward home base. The pursuit continued for several minutes before Yanagiya was forced to break off engagement. He was now far from Bougainville, dangerously low on ammunition, and additional P-38s might turn back to protect their damaged comrade. He reversed course toward Balele airfield, where the other 5 Zero pilots had already landed, their aircraft undamaged, but their mission representing catastrophic failure. Heinz P-38 would never reach Guadalcanal, disappearing over the ocean as the only American loss of the mission. This single victory could not alter the fundamental reality that the Imperial Japanese Navy's most important leader was dead, killed while under the protection of 6 of the 204th Air Group's most experienced fighter pilots. The failure of the Zero escort on April 18, 1943, cannot be properly understood without examining the fundamental technological disparity that had developed by this stage of the Pacific conflict. The A6M-3, revolutionary when it first appeared in 1940, was by 1943 operating on borrowed time against increasingly superior American aircraft designs. The very design philosophy that rendered the Zero dominant during the war's early phases, radical weight reduction to achieve superior range and maneuverability, had transformed into a fatal weakness against opponents who had learned to systematically exploit its limitations. The Zero's complete absence of armor protection meant that even glancing hits could kill or incapacitate the pilot. The lack of self-sealing fuel tanks transformed the aircraft into flying incendiary bombs when struck by incendiary ammunition. Most critically for the Yamamoto mission, the Zero's maximum velocity of 388 miles per hour and poor high-speed handling characteristics meant it could neither catch nor escape from the new generation of American fighters. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines producing a combined 2,800 horsepower compared to the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower engine, could dictate the terms of any engagement, choosing when to attack and when to disengage at will. The defensive formation employed by the Zero escort reflected tactical doctrine developed against Chinese opponents flying obsolete aircraft during the late 1930s. The positioning of fighters above and behind the bombers they protected made perfect tactical sense when the primary threat consisted of other fighters diving from altitude to attack. This formation allowed the escorts to maintain energy advantage while keeping visual contact with their charges. By 1943, however, American tactics had evolved far beyond the simple diving attacks of the war's opening months. The American adoption of boom and zoom technique, utilizing superior speed to execute single high-speed passes rather than engaging in turning dogfights, rendered traditional Japanese defensive formations effectively obsolete. The P-38s attacking from below could exploit their speed advantage to strike before the Zeros could react, then escape before the Japanese fighters could bring their superior maneuverability to bear. The Japanese possessed no effective counter to this tactic with the Zero, as the aircraft simply lacked sufficient speed to pursue or escape from hit-and-run attacks. Perhaps the most damaging failure involved the complete absence of awareness that American forces had broken Japanese naval codes. The detailed itinerary broadcast 4 days before Yamamoto's flight might as well have been transmitted directly to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. Japanese confidence in their code security was so absolute that they never seriously considered the possibility that Americans might be reading their most secret communications. This overconfidence extended to the planning of Yamamoto's flight itself. No diversionary measures were implemented, no last-minute route changes considered, no additional security precautions taken despite flying the Navy's most important leader through an active combat zone just 2 days after concluding Operation One Go. The 6 Zero pilots touched down at Balala airfield in shocked silence. There were no immediate accusations, no charges of cowardice or incompetence. Everyone understood they had encountered an ambush prepared with intelligence they could not have anticipated. The weight of failure, however, was crushing. They had been selected for the highest honor imaginable, protecting Admiral Yamamoto, and they had failed. Within the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture, where responsibility and shame are collective rather than individual, all 6 pilots understood that their lives would be forever defined by this single catastrophic failure. At Rabaul, news of Yamamoto's death spread through the naval air groups like a physical blow. The admiral represented more than simply a commander. He embodied Japanese naval power itself, the one leader who truly understood both Japan's potential and its fundamental limitations in conducting war against America's industrial might. His death represented not merely a tactical loss, but a psychological catastrophe. Morale, already battered by months of attrition warfare in the Solomons, plummeted further. The Japanese High Command immediately classified all details surrounding Yamamoto's death as top secret. When the Japanese public was finally informed on May 21, 1943, they were told only that the admiral had died while directing operations at the front lines. On June 5, 1943, Japan conducted a state funeral for Admiral Yamamoto, an honor reserved exclusively for the nation's greatest heroes. The ceremony in Tokyo was attended by the emperor himself, and the entire nation observed a moment of silence. For the 6-0 pilots at Rabaul, the funeral represented formal acknowledgement of their failure. 2 days following the funeral, on June 7th, the Japanese launched a massive air offensive against American positions in the Solomons, specifically targeting the Russell Islands. The mission involved 81 Zeros, 12 carrying incendiary bombs, the remainder providing escort, all from the 204th Air Group. During this June 7th raid, 2 of the Yamamoto escort pilots met their end. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka was shot down and killed during the 90-minute battle that witnessed 23 to 24 Japanese aircraft losses against approximately 50 Allied fighters. Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki also perished in the same engagement. Both pilots flew Zeros armed with incendiary bombs under their wings, pressing their attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. Their deaths marked the beginning of what would become a pattern among the Yamamoto escorts seeking redemption through combat. During that same June 7th raid, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya's war took a dramatically different turn. After completing his bombing run on Russell Island, 2 F-4F Wildcats caught his Zero in a climbing turn. Despite desperate evasive maneuvering, American .50 caliber rounds smashed into his cockpit. One bullet struck his right hand as it gripped the control stick, destroying it almost completely. Only his smallest finger remained attached. Another round tore through his right leg, severing major arteries and filling his flight boot with blood. Somehow Yanagiya maintained consciousness and aircraft control using only his left hand. Fighting against shock and massive blood loss, repeatedly shouting to keep himself conscious, he managed to fly his crippled Zero to the Japanese base at Munda. Unable to lower his landing gear with his destroyed right hand, he executed a belly landing on the coral runway. Japanese Marines extracted him from the cockpit more dead than alive, immediately amputating what remained of his right hand. Against all medical odds, he survived and was evacuated to Japan, his war over but his life preserved. On June 16, 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki, the escort flight leader, was killed while attacking Allied transports off Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. He perished alongside squadron leader Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano during another raid against American shipping. Morisaki's death, occurring just 9 days after Hidaka and Okazaki, left only 2 of the original 6 escorts still flying. On July 1, 1943, Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinue went missing in action during an escort mission for dive bombers attacking the Allied anchorage at Rendova Island. He was never seen again, his ultimate fate unknown. With Tsujinue's disappearance, only one member of the original escort remained in combat operations. Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita, already credited with approximately 30 victories when Yamamoto died, chose a different interpretation of redemption. Rather than seeking immediate death like his comrades, he decided that destroying American aircraft represented superior atonement than a single glorious death. Throughout the summer of 1943, Sugita continued adding to his score in the skies over the Solomon Islands. By August, he had raised his tally to approximately 40 victories, becoming the leading ace in the Solomon Islands campaign. In August 1943, Sugita's first close encounter with death occurred when his Zero was caught by American fighters while attacking bombers. His aircraft was hit in the engine and caught fire. In an act that most Japanese pilots would consider deeply shameful, Sugita bailed out of his burning fighter, parachuting down into Japanese-held territory with severe burns. Following treatment, he was evacuated to Japan for recovery, temporarily ending his combat career. By March 1944, after 7 months of recovery, Sugita returned to combat as a petty officer second class with the 263rd Air Group in Guam. The Pacific War had shifted dramatically during his absence. The Americans had seized the Marshall Islands, neutralized the major base at Truk, and were preparing to assault the Marianas. In June 1944, his unit merged with the 201st Air Group in the Philippines, which was reorganized as the first official kamikaze unit under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. Sugita refused kamikaze missions and was ordered back to Japan. In June 1944, Sugita participated in what Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the aerial component of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, Japanese naval aviation launched its largest carrier operation since Midway. The result was catastrophic. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft. Sugita survived when his unit, the 263rd Air Group, was essentially annihilated. 6 aircraft attempted escape to Guam but were ambushed by F-6F Hellcats. 5 were shot down immediately. Sugita's Zero, hit repeatedly with navigation equipment destroyed, somehow reached a Japanese base on Rota, the sole survivor of his entire unit. In January 1945, now a chief petty officer, Sugita joined the elite 301st Fighter Squadron of the 343rd Naval Air Group at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. By this time, he had accumulated 70 officially credited victories. On April 15, 1945, almost exactly 2 years after Yamamoto's death, American carrier aircraft attacked Kanoya. F-6F Hellcats from USS Independence and USS Randolph caught the 343rd Air Group during takeoff operations. Sugita's Kawanishi N-1K-2J Shiden-Kai fighter was hit just as it became airborne, crashing just beyond the runway. He died instantly at age 28, having survived longer than any other combat pilot from the Yamamoto escort, but never achieving the redemption he sought. In Japan, Kenji Yanagiya underwent lengthy recovery from his June 7, 1943 wounds. The amputation of his right hand ended any possibility of returning to combat operations. Promoted to warrant officer and assigned as an instructor at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, he trained new pilots for the remainder of the war. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Yanagiya was one of approximately 5,000 surviving Japanese naval aviators from the more than 25,000 who served during the war. Following the war, Yanagiya returned to Tokyo and found employment in a small trading company. For nearly 3 decades, he told no one about his role in the Yamamoto mission. The burden of being the sole survivor remained a private shame he could not share. In the mid-1970s, Japanese aviation historian Akira Yoshimura, researching a book about the Yamamoto mission, discovered through careful investigation that one escort pilot had survived the war. He tracked down Yanagiya, now in his 50s, working in Tokyo. Through multiple interviews, Yanagiya's story emerged for the first time publicly. The selection for the mission, the pride of being chosen, the formation over Bougainville, the devastating speed of the American attack, the impossible physics of intervention. Yanagiya provided the first comprehensive Japanese perspective on the mission's failure. He described how the P-38s appeared from an unexpected angle at an unexpected time, how the Zero escort was positioned according to doctrine that proved inadequate, how the American fighters were faster and executed their attack with perfect timing. He emphasized that protecting 2 bombers from 16 P-38s with only 6 Zero fighters was nearly impossible given the circumstances. On April 15 through 17, 1988, the National Museum of the Pacific War, Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, organized a symposium commemorating the 45th anniversary of Operation Vengeance. 8 surviving American pilots attended, and through Japanese contacts, they extended an invitation to Yanagiya. He accepted, making his first trip to America at age 68. Contemporary newspaper accounts explicitly identify that the lone Japanese attending the meeting was former Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya. During the symposium, Yanagiya met mission leader John Mitchell and presented him with a small handheld compass. He shook hands with Rex Barber and the other American pilots. An official oral history interview was recorded on April 15, 1988, now archived through the portal to Texas History. Video documentation captures panel discussions featuring Yanagiya alongside American pilots, including Frank Holmes, Lewis Kittle, Jack Jacobson, Douglas Canning, and Roger Ames. Yanagiya lived another 20 years following the symposium, giving interviews and appearing in documentaries. He maintained that the failure to protect Yamamoto was inevitable given the circumstances of obsolescent aircraft, outdated doctrine, and facing an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike. On February 29, 2008, Kenji Yanagiya died at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. The failure to protect Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, ultimately represented a failure of technology and intelligence rather than courage or skill. The Zero, revolutionary in 1940, had become dangerously obsolescent by 1943. Its lack of armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and most critically competitive speed rendered it incapable of countering American boom and zoom tactics. The P-38 Lightning could engage and disengage at will, dictating combat terms in a manner that negated the Zero's advantages in maneuverability. The A6M-3 Model 22's maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet was significantly slower than the P-38's 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Lightning's twin Allison engines produced combined horsepower that dwarfed the Zero's single power plant. The P-38 could climb 1,650 feet per minute faster than the Zero and maintained superior performance above 20,000 feet thanks to its turbo superchargers. The breaking of the JN-25D cipher represents one of the greatest intelligence successes in military history. The detailed itinerary broadcast by the Japanese gave the Americans everything needed for the interception. The message, sent to multiple commands as part of post-operation I-GO coordination, specified exact times and locations. This intelligence coup was magnified by Japanese overconfidence in their code security and failure to implement basic operational security measures. The Japanese Navy's inability to conceive that their codes might be compromised persisted even after Yamamoto's death. While some officers suspected the Americans had been warned, the Navy leadership rejected the possibility that JN-25D had been broken. This willful blindness allowed American codebreakers to continue reading Japanese communications for months afterward. The positioning of the escort reflected tactics developed against inferior Chinese opposition in the late 1930s. The assumption that attacks would come from above, the spacing that prevented mutual support, and the altitude differential that made rapid intervention impossible all contributed to the failure. The 6 Zero pilots were positioned in 2 formations of 3 aircraft each, at approximately 6,500 feet, 1,500 feet above and behind the 2 Betty bombers. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized individual skill over coordinated tactics. While American pilots trained extensively in mutual support techniques like the thatch weave, Japanese pilots were expected to prevail through superior airmanship. This worked when Japanese pilots held qualitative edge in both aircraft and experience. By 1943, however, American pilots were increasingly well-trained and flying superior aircraft. For the 60 pilots who flew escort on April 18, 1943, the failure defined the remainder of their lives. Within 3 months, 4 were dead. Hidaka and Okazaki on June 7th, Morisaki on June 16th, and Sujinue missing on July 1st. Shoichi Sugita survived until April 15, 1945, accumulating 70 official victories before dying during a takeoff scramble at Kanoya. Only Kenji Yanagiya survived the war, living with the burden of failure until 2008. The 204th Air Group, from which all 6 escorts came, suffered severe losses throughout 1943. The unit had been formed on November 1, 1942, by renaming the 6th Air Group and operated from Rabaul during the Solomon Islands campaign. By war's end, few of its original pilots survived. Yamamoto's death dealt a psychological blow to Japan from which it never recovered. He was not merely a fleet commander, but the intellectual architect of Japanese naval strategy. His understanding of American industrial capacity, his warnings about protracted war, and his ability to conceive operations like Pearl Harbor made him irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's vision and charisma. For the Americans, the successful assassination validated their intelligence capabilities and demonstrated their growing ability to execute complex, long-range operations. The mission became a template for similar operations throughout the Pacific War. 18 P-38s were initially assigned to Operation Vengeance, though only 16 actually flew after 2 developed mechanical problems during startup procedures. The failure to protect Yamamoto was not a failure of the 6 escort pilots, but a failure of the entire Japanese military system by 1943. It represents the moment when individual courage and skill could no longer compensate for technological and intelligence disadvantages. The 0 pilots executed everything their training and doctrine prescribed, but their training and doctrine were fatally flawed. Could the 0 escort have saved Yamamoto if positioned differently? The harsh answer is probably not. Even if they had spotted the P-38 seconds earlier, even if positioned lower, the speed and firepower advantage of the American fighters was decisive. The P-38s needed only seconds to destroy the unarmored bombers. Different positioning might have made the attack more costly, but could not have prevented it. The story of why the Japanese pilots failed to protect Admiral Yamamoto thus represents not merely a tale of a single mission gone wrong, but a microcosm of Japan's larger defeat in the Pacific War. It demonstrates how technological superiority, intelligence advantage, and tactical innovation can overwhelm traditional military virtues like courage, skill, and dedication. The 6-0 pilots represented the finest of experienced naval aviation, but by April 1943, experience was no longer sufficient. The mission occurred at the culmination of Operation One Go, Yamamoto's last offensive that claimed to have sunk 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports while destroying 175 Allied aircraft. Actual Allied losses were approximately 25 aircraft and several ships. The operation involved concentrating 350 aircraft, including carrier planes from Zuikaku, Zuiho, Junyo, and Hiyo, for strikes between April 1st and 16th, 1943. Japanese losses totaled 55 aircraft. Yamamoto was flying to congratulate the units that participated in Operation Tigo when American intelligence, having broken the JN-25D code, learned of his exact itinerary. The precision of American planning, 16 P-38s navigating 420 miles in radio silence to arrive at exactly 9:35 hours, represents the evolution of American capabilities by 1943. The wreckage of Betty Bomber No. 323 remains in the Bougainville jungle, a memorial to Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. The 6-0 pilots who failed to protect him are remembered primarily through Yanagiya's testimony. Their failure deserves consideration, for it encapsulates the tragedy of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War, skilled warriors undone by technological inferiority, doctrinal rigidity, and intelligence failures. Kenji Yanagiya died on February 29, 2008, at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. With his passing, the story of the Yamamoto escort passed from living memory into history. The lessons remain relevant: the danger of technological complacency, the importance of intelligence security, the need for doctrine to evolve with circumstances, and ultimately the limits of human courage in the face of systematic disadvantage. The 6-0 pilots who flew on April 18, 1943, were not failures. They were men asked to accomplish the impossible, and their inability to achieve it marked not their inadequacy but the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. They flew obsolescent aircraft, followed outdated doctrine, and faced an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike. Their story represents one of the Pacific War's most poignant tragedies: warriors defeated not by lack of courage, but by the changing nature of warfare itself.